Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for the 2023 Murray L. Bobb Memorial Lecture. I'm Ann Green, the Executive Director here at James Prendergast Library. The Murray L. Bobb Memorial Lecture began in 2004 to honor Murray L. Bobb, longtime Director of the Chautauqua Cattaraugus Library System and the James Prendergast Library. Mr. Bobb had a national reputation as a passionate advocate of public libraries, and the James Prendergast Library hosts a memorial lecture in his honor each year. In keeping with his passion for reading and discussing ideas, the Memorial Lecture Program brings a scholar to the library to address a significant topic each year. Renee Bobb is with us tonight, and she'd like to say a few words.
I guess this is the
Yes, perfect.
microphone.
Perfect, yes.
Oops, sorry.
No, you're fine.
I'm Renee Bobb, and thank you for introducing me. It's been more than 20 years since we lost our dear husband, father, and grandfather suddenly on a trip to Japan. We struggled with our grief, but we decided that it would be, together with Kathy Wade, who was the director at that time, that it would be fitting to designate an annual memorial lecture in his honor. Now it's 20 years since these lectures have been here these have ranged in topics very widely as Murray's interests, from music with Joanne Falletta, to environmental issues, to Japan, U.S. politics with my son Daniel, to food scarcity. These lectures have enlightened and delighted Jamestown audiences. Tonight's lecture will be no different, I'm sure. Murray thought very highly of Justice Jackson and his writings. And I really look forward to hearing from Kristan.
Oh, you're good. Yep, you're fine. I'm standing directly behind you, sorry.
Yeah, and I want to thank Annie Green and the staff for continuing these lectures. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. I would now like to introduce our 2023 lecturer, Kristan McMahon. Kristan has served as president of the Robert H. Jackson Center since April of 2019. She is a former principal with Vetted Solutions, an executive search firm specializing in association and nonprofit recruiting and consulting in Washington, D.C., where she helped guide a transformational process for the company's executive searches. Previously, she was corporate counsel for Verizon in Arlington, Virginia, advising all business entities on various antitrust issues, including deal analysis and compliance with antitrust competition laws. Before joining Verizon, Kristan served as a staff attorney for Howry Law Firm, where she was part of the antitrust team leading government investigations and litigations for numerous global Fortune 500 companies. Kristan received a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism, Mass Communication, and Political Science at St. Bonaventure University, a Juris Doctor from the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and a certificate from the Communications Law Institute of the Columbus School of Law for her special studies in communications law. Tonight, Kristan will be speaking about Robert H. Jackson and his legacy of justice today. Please join me in welcoming Kristan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, Renee. Thank you for establishing this lecture. I am honored to be the 20th speaker for this, and I hope that you all enjoy tonight's discussion. We're going to get to Ukraine, but in order to understand some of that, I feel like we need to start with Jackson as the foundation. So that is where we will begin. And I will take you through, very quickly, some relevant Jackson history, some discussion of Nuremberg, and then the tribunals that came after Nuremberg, and then we can talk about Ukraine today. So, our Justice Jackson, as you all, I think, probably know, grew up in this area. This is his touchstone, and his formative years here really created the depth of his understanding of how law should work. He did not go to college. He did not graduate from law school. He attended 1 year of law school, and that was all. He did a year of apprenticeship here in Jamestown during a super senior year in high school, went to Albany Law School for the year of classes. He was too young to graduate, which is why he didn't. In New York State at the time, you had to be 21 years old in order to sit for the bar. And when he was wrapping up his studies, he was only 20. So he and a handful of classmates received a notice from Albany Law School that they would not be graduating. They would receive a certificate of completion instead. And so then he came back to Jamestown and did another year of apprenticeship. And once he turned 21, sat for the bar and passed it. New York State is actually one of the few states in the country you can still do this in. You do not have to go to law school in order to be a lawyer in New York State. But it is a hard row. Right now, the apprenticeship tends to be about 7 years. So not quite as easy as it was then, although we have more laws now too. So while he was in Albany, however, he met two people who would become very important to him. The first is his wife, Irene, and the second was a young state senator, first term, named Frank Roosevelt. Now, before Jackson and Franklin really hook up, Bob Jackson spends 20 years here in Jamestown practicing law. And he really acquired the reputation of being an egalitarian lawyer. He represented those who had struggles finding representation otherwise. In this town, it would be some of the Italians. It would be some of the African Americans. He represented big companies. He represented small companies. His very first suit was a cow paternity suit, for which he won $5. But he was also the city's corporation counsel when John Wright wanted to bring the telephone system to Jamestown. He took on Ma Bell in order to bring the franchise here. And so that gives you just a sense of the breadth of his representation. By the time he moves to Washington, D.C., and I'll skip over a lot of his D.C. service other than to walk through some highlights, he was making about $30,000 a year. This is in the early 1930s. Most definitely took a pay cut to move to Washington, D.C. to begin his federal service. But that, for him, that public service, that deeper commitment, that deeper contribution to society was very important to him. So, Robert H. Jackson's meteoric rise in Washington, D.C. He heads there in 1934, and he is asked to be the general counsel for what is the precursor to the IRS. He spends about 18 months in that role and then moves over to the Department of Justice, also in the tax department. Spends about a year in that role and then stays within the Department of Justice and moves over to the antitrust division. Spends about 18 months in that role, and then he is elevated to the Solicitor General of the United States. And this means he is the main representative for the United States in a federal court. That is often the Supreme Court, but not entirely the Supreme Court. During the approximately 2 years he's in this role, he takes 44 cases to the Supreme Court. He argues 44 cases before the Supreme Court. He is successful in 38 of those 44 cases. On at least two occasions, he argues 2 cases before the court in the same day. And in one 10-day period, he argues 7 different cases before the court. This is a pace that we just don't have today. You know, the Supreme Court hears about 88 cases a year. It's, sub 100 at this point. This is just, it's not a feat that will likely ever be repeated, just given the pace that the court accepts cases today. The Solicitor General role is his favorite role. It is purely about the law. There are really no politics attached to it. He is wildly successful, as I mentioned. And Justice Brandeis, Louis Brandeis, who was a fairly persnickety justice, once described him as he should have been Solicitor General for life. That is not to be, however. Remember, it's a meteoric rise. So then in January of 1940, he becomes the Attorney General of the United States. And in this role, so obviously January of 1940 to July of 1941, the United States is trying to figure out how do they support Great Britain and the Allies. Congress has specifically passed laws that we are not allowed to give them money and we are not allowed to give them munitions. And so this, as you might imagine, is all Great Britain really wants. So Jackson is tasked with coming up with a way to enable the United States to support the war effort without entering the war and certainly working around these prohibitions in Congress. What he comes up with is the Lend-Lease Act. And for the general scheme of this is that there are a series of islands off the coast of Canada and also in the Caribbean that the United States would like to borrow for defensive purposes, and they are owned by Great Britain. So we ask Great Britain if we can rent space on these islands, and our payment to Great Britain are some warships that are going to be decommissioned and some other munitions that will be helpful to them. And so that gives you a sense of his creative thinking. And there he is at his Attorney General desk. He is in this role, as I mentioned, for about 18 months. Oh, and I should mention this Lend-Lease Act is also, and the power that Germany was exerting at the time, Jackson started seeing some of the early beginnings of these aggressive wars and like how do countries react to this. And so this is part of what's forming in his head as he's thinking about when this war is ending. What is justice at that point? So these thoughts for him have a foundation far earlier than one might think. In July of 1941, he is appointed to the United States Supreme Court as an associate justice. He serves in this role until his death in 1954, but from about the middle of 1945 until the middle of 1946, he steps away. And he steps away to go first to London and then to Germany. So let us focus on that. He has been the subject of a few Jeopardy questions, so when I can pull those out, I like to. All right, so Franklin Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 1945. President Truman is sworn in, and he is really trying to figure out what's going on. FDR was not good about including his vice president in discussions or negotiations, so Truman has really no sense of where things in the war are standing. However, he retains, to my knowledge, all, if not, or at least most of FDR's cabinet. And his cabinet ministers are very aware of a lot of discussions that Justice Jackson and the president have been having about the end of the war and what comes next. For both of them, for most of the leaders of this generation, this is the second major war in their lifetimes. This is something after World War I they thought would never happen again. And so the fact that basically within a generation it does happen again, they're now starting to think about how do we stop this? How do we stop this from happening again? These countries should not be doing this to each other. And so the cabinet secretaries are talking to President Truman about this, and Truman asks to speak with Jackson. Does it through intermediaries first, but then they do have some conversations. Truman is attracted by Jackson's ideas for justice. In all of the conversations that they have, the conversations focus on justice, not vengeance. And so for him, that taking some of that, and I think as we all know our World War I history, some of Germany's reaction that caused World War II was based on what they thought was vengeance being extracted against them after World War I. Jackson, and one of the reasons I wanted to run through his career trajectory, also had some skills that one might not find in a normal jurist. So he had been in the cabinet, so he had diplomatic skills. He had been a speaker before Congress on a lot of New Deal issues for the president. So he had that public speaking. And as you know, it's no secret, I love the way the man talks. I love the way the man writes. He is not pithy by today's standards. He's not good for a tweet, but his command of language is hard to beat. And so they also are aware of obviously his stature. And so given that he is a Supreme Court justice, President Truman is hopeful that appointing somebody of that stature will encourage the other allied powers to do the same. And it does. So there is the official portrait of Truman and Jackson. And Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union also appointed some of their leading legal lights. For Jackson, this decision, although this is sort of his ability to promulgate all of these ideas he's been having about justice, this was not an easy decision for him. He did see it as his ability to serve in the war. So finally, he had actually attempted to resign a couple of times over the course of his time on the court. The president, for the most part, is the one who talked him off that ledge, saying, "You're far more valuable to me where you are, rather than having a gun in your hand somewhere in Europe." So for Jackson, part of this is finally he gets to have his military service. His time away from the court, he knew, was not going to be popular with his colleagues. That would leave them with an 8-person court. And so to the extent that there would be any ties, they would either need to be held over, or there would need to be deep discussions, possible rehearings, and there were sometimes ties during the time he was away. And he also thought this might mean he would never be able to run for public office himself. Before FDR decided to run for his third term, he was actually positioning Jackson as a potential presidential candidate. He had previously been positioned as a potential New York gubernatorial candidate. And so, Jackson had these flirtations, let's say, with different kinds of public service. And I don't think it's a secret that he had some ambition. So, the court certainly is a wonderful trajectory, but he wasn't sure that would be his end trajectory. By taking this role we don't actually know where it's going to be yet. By taking on this role as chief counsel for the United States, he's pretty sure that means there will be no other type of public service for him but the court. He also wanted to, I think for him, he thought it might end up shortening his life. Just the stress of this, the deep work that would be needed to be done here. And, passing away at the age of 64, it's hard to say that was a but-for cause, but it is a possible contributor to that. Now, we take for granted, and this is something I think is really important for our conversation today, especially as we get to Ukraine, this was a Herculean effort to bring the Nuremberg trials to bear. We take it for granted that it was always going to happen because it did, but there were many times that this looked like this was going to completely fall apart. So a couple of challenges. Great Britain and the United States had a similar legal system. France, Germany, and the Soviet Union had a similar legal system. Those legal systems had sufficient differences between the two of them to make one side or the other trying to practice in the other feel very uncomfortable. They ended up with a compromise of how witnesses were treated, how documents were treated, how evidence was treated. So everybody ended up feeling a wee bit uncomfortable with the system, but that was as fair as they thought they could make it. The United States was also the only party empowered to actually make a decision. So Truman sent Jackson off with complete faith and the complete imprimatur to commit the United States to whatever Jackson felt the United States needed to be committed to. Everybody else had to run things back by their home governments. And as you might imagine, given communications at the time, sometimes that was a challenge. Also, given the political philosophies at the time, that was also a little bit of a challenge, depending on what they were discussing. And so there was even a time Jackson flew to London in June of 1945. The London Charter Agreement was signed in August of 1945. In the approximately 7 weeks of the negotiations, Jackson flew to Europe to meet with President Truman, and Truman once again said to him, "If you feel like the United States needs to go this alone, we will do that," because the vision of justice was more important. Happily, they were able to come to an agreement on all of these various pieces, and the London Charter Agreement was signed on August 8th of 1945. The trial then kicks off in November of 1945. And this is, this is a document-heavy trial. This is a lot of using and the press described it as an exceptionally boring trial because it was a lot of, this is the document. Can you tell me what this document is? Did you write this document? Can you tell me what this document now says? And so it was a lot of that sort of thing as opposed to sensational stories. And that's not to say that there weren't witnesses telling their stories, but Jackson wanted to create a record that would be unimpeachable, that nobody would doubt that these atrocities had occurred, that there is clearly the evidence, and the evidence is in the record of what happened. So those are also things to keep in mind. He did describe this as supremely interesting and important work. So that gives you a sense of his mindset. So some things to note about the IMT that I think also have some relevance today. Oh, before I do that, let me see if this plays. Because the first paragraph of his opening statement is one of my most favorite things.
For the United States of America. The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
Something to keep in mind. So, there are a handful of things about the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg that I think are also instructive for us as we're thinking about justice going forward from here. So one, there were not just individuals on trial. There also were 7 organizations that were put on trial, such as the SS and the SA. And that made future trials more consistent and a little bit easier, because if you didn't have to prove every time that the SS was a criminal organization, or you didn't run the risk of sometimes the SS is a criminal organization, sometimes it's not, since it was declared to be so in the first trial, all you had to do for subsequent trials was prove that so-and-so was a member of the SS. And that was the first hurdle to overcome, and then obviously work through whatever individual things that person had done. 2, the defendants came from a wide range of leadership. These were military. These were cabinet ministers. These were media. These were associated governments. And so something to keep in mind as we're thinking through the Russian Federation and Ukraine, that there's a wide scope of potentially responsible people. One person was tried in absentia. Now, this is something the international humanitarian law community generally does not like to do, because usually a trial in absentia means the defendant doesn't even know that they're on trial. That's unlikely to be the case in this instance, as we, since the ICC has already issued arrest warrants for President Putin and one of his cabinet ministers, and that's been reported to the world. When a trial occurs, it will be quite clear that he is on trial, even if he is not physically there. So it is something the international community is getting a little more comfortable with in terms of this particular trial. But in general, trials in absentia are something they try to avoid. All right, so let's start talking about his legacy. There were 4 crimes defined at Nuremberg, and we'll get to those in a second. Those are the crimes that we largely still use today. And so we walk through what those are. These are the crimes at Nuremberg: crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and a common plan or conspiracy. Now, for Robert H. Jackson, that common plan conspiracy crime he thought was the linchpin crime, because if you couldn't prove that this was a concerted effort you would once again go back to individuals being responsible as opposed to a mechanism for stopping this in the future. That's not how the world sees it today. And honestly, outside of the United States and Great British, so for the continental legal system, the crime of conspiracy didn't really exist. This was also one of the things that the French and the Germans and the Soviet Union were most uncomfortable with. But that being said, this has formed the basis of what has followed. So first, the ad hoc tribunal for Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. This is in 1993. So this is the next tribunal. So from 1945 until 1993. This is the next international tribunal, almost 50 years. But from there, it follows a little more rapidly. Then you come to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which is in 1994, and the Special Court for Sierra Leone in 2002. While the Special Court for Sierra Leone is going on, the Rome Statute is being negotiated. Now, the Rome Statute is what creates the International Criminal Court and defines the crimes that the world operates under today. Genocide, which corresponds to crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and then one that was added about a decade later, and we'll get to what, because that's actually one of the sticking points for Ukraine, the crime of aggression. So let me tell you a little bit about what each of these crimes mean. So, genocide, the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group by killing its members or by other means, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction, in whole or in part, or imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children to another group. And we'll get to that in a second. Crimes against humanity. Serious violations committed as part of a large-scale attack against any civilian population. There are 15 forms of these crimes, and they are such things as murder, rape, imprisonment, enforced disappearances, enslavement, particularly of women and children, sexual slavery, torture, apartheid, and deportation. War crimes. Grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, which include the use of child soldiers, the killing or torture of civilians and prisoners of war, intentionally directing attacks against hospitals, historic monuments, or buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes. And then the crime of aggression. As I mentioned, this was added by amending the Rome Statute, and that amendment happened in 2010, but the crime didn't become active until 2018. So there was a long lead time for countries to get comfortable, and also they had to specifically sign on to that amendment in order for it to cover them. The use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, integrity, or independence of another state. This is the map of the world as it applies to the Rome Statute. The countries in the teal color are those who have signed the Rome Statute, and so they have agreed to be bound by the conditions therein. There are about 40 countries that never signed. Those are the ones in orange. And it will not surprise you, these are countries like Iraq, North Korea, India, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And then there are several dozen that signed but never ratified, and those are the countries in yellow. That includes the United States, that includes Egypt and Iran and Israel and Russia as well. And then there are two actually that signed and then have withdrawn. So they are Burundi and the Philippines. Both because the ICC was indicating that they would be opening investigations into some of the actions of the presidents of each of those countries. And so they withdrew from the Rome Statute, so the ICC would not have jurisdiction over them. So this leads us, though, to our current challenge. On February 24th, 2022, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. Within a week, Ukraine had petitioned the International Court of Justice, which is the UN's main justice body, as a result of this. And that case is still ongoing. March of 2022, obviously still masked at that point. They just had their second hearing in September of 2023. And this is sort of a novel approach, in my opinion. So what has happened here is that, so basically 2 days after the invasion, Ukraine lodged a complaint saying and asking for an interpretation and an application of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. We actually just celebrated the 75th anniversary of this convention. It was on December 9th. In short, Russia has alleged that its special military operation in Ukraine was necessary to stop the genocide against Russian-speaking population in the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine. Ukraine filed the complaint to demonstrate that there is no legal basis for the military intervention and that the allegations of genocide are unfounded. So the Russian Federation is actually the one using the conventions as the justification for this invasion. Now, that interpretation of the conventions is one that outside of Russia is not receiving much support. So from the closing argument in the September 2023 hearing, let me read you. Ukraine says the sole question before the court at the jurisdictional stage was, may a powerful state falsely accuse its neighbor of genocide, then use illegal force to kill its citizens, devastate their homeland, and destabilize the global legal order on the pretext of preventing and punishing genocide. Ukraine's legal team said the court's decision of the question will help define the scope of this court's power to stop the flagrant abuse of the world's most important human rights treaty. We likely will not have a ruling until early 2024, which honestly is moving fairly fast for the judicial system. But all I can say at this point is stay tuned to the news for how the court actually interprets this. This action also is on top of another action that has been at the ICJ since 2017. And that was related to Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea. So in 2014, the Russian Federation invaded the Ukrainian territory of Crimea, saying that it was protecting the citizens that were there. Ukraine's claim in the earlier case is that there are alleged violations of international conventions on the suppression of the financing of terrorism and the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. So the Crimea has been under Russian control since 2014. At the moment, about 20% of the eastern part of Ukraine is also under Russian control. So I want to front those facts for you because that's part of what's going to complicate any peace negotiations in this. This is not going to be something easy to resolve. There's a lot of activity on this, and so some things to think about. The typical path for a referral to the ICC is through the UN Security Council. The Russian Federation is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and they have a veto, which means that typical path is not open because they will veto any try, and it has to be unanimous. You could try a path through the General Assembly, and the General Assembly has voted on a number of resolutions related to Ukraine. That has never been done before, so it would be an untried path, which for those of you who have ever spoken to a lawyer, you know we are not particularly fond of uncertainty. And so we really would prefer that there have been somebody who had done that before us. In the 22 months, it's been almost, Christmas Eve will be 22 months basically since the invasion. The center has been fortunate to have a lot of conversations with experts about what is happening and how these thoughts are developing. And I certainly do not purport to be an expert on this, but as I often tell friends, I feel like I've read a few chapters ahead, so let me tell you what I know. I also, just this past week, was in Lviv, Ukraine, for a symposium commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Genocide Conventions and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, in an interesting note, were signed on back-to-back days. So December 9th for the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10th. So here is some of what they have been talking about. The ICC has been investigating the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and the genocide claims basically since the war started. There's also very little dispute that the ICC has the power to prosecute those crimes. Where it gets squishy is on the crime of aggression. And since that's where a lot of the conversations are, and squishy, of course, is a technical term, I will talk about that first, but I want to walk through a little bit about what has been happening already. So there have been more than 250 Ukrainian-led prosecutions since the invasion that have resulted in about 25 convictions so far. This is a departure from how this usually works. Usually during the course of a war, the prosecutions do not happen. It waits typically until the war finishes. But in this instance, because some of these are soldiers, Russian soldiers who may be leaving the country, some of these have been trials in absentia, there is a relatively fast justice mechanism that is working here. The United States has loaned Eli Rosenbaum, who has been the United States chief Nazi hunter for the last several decades, to Ukraine to help them understand how to develop a process for the investigation and the prosecution of this, since that was basically his role for the last 30 years. He also heads the team for the U.S. War Crimes Accountability. The United States has amended its War Crimes Act, and this now gives them the ability to establish jurisdiction over those who commit war crimes in other countries but are present in the United States. So it used to be that we could not, if they were not a United States citizen committing the war crime, the United States War Crimes Act did not allow us jurisdiction over that. So now that has been lifted. It has also lifted the statute of limitations. So that gives us a much broader scope of people who can be held accountable. I should qualify that. It's not for all. The statute of limitations wasn't lifted for all, but it was lifted for any Geneva or Hague Convention violations, which make up the vast majority of that. And the president just signed that bill on January 5th, 2023. So it's a very recent development. And even more recent, in the last week, the United States filed war crime charges against Russians accused of torturing an American in Ukraine. This is the first time in the 30 years that the War Crimes Act statute has existed that this has ever happened. So Merrick Garland also made the announcement that this is the first of likely more. So we shall see how that develops. This will be a new area for the United States to work through. With the crime of aggression, when these conversations started in February and March of last year, the international community was pretty convinced that the ICC did not have jurisdiction to prosecute Russia for the crime of aggression because Russia had not signed the Rome Statute. Ukraine also is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, but they have submitted themselves to ICC jurisdiction. So that causes a little bit of a gray area, but because Russia is not a signatory, the international community felt pretty strongly that the ICC could not do it. The chief prosecutor of the ICC, however, does not necessarily agree with that, and so he actually made many public statements that he's not sure why there is such confusion over this. In his mind, the entirety of the Rome Statute is under the ICC's purview. So that being said, the way the conversation seems to have developed is that there's now a general assumption that the crime of aggression will be a separate tribunal. Part of this, I think, is because they're hoping that one will move faster than the prosecution of the other three crimes, but because there are certainly crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity that are occurring. The International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, and I think it's shortened to ICPA, was officially stood up in February of 2023. It started its work in July of 2023. This is a body that is located within The Hague, within Eurojust. It is also fully funded, which for international law mechanisms is a little unusual. A lot of them, so for example, all of those individual tribunals I mentioned, Yugoslavia and Rwanda and Sierra Leone, they all had to go out and fundraise in order to be able to pay their staff, in order to move their prosecutions forward. Now, their idea of fundraising sometimes was going to Germany and asking for $5 million, so it wasn't like coming to individuals, but it was still like there is not a mechanism in the international world that automatically funds these tribunals. The ICPA, however, which is an investigative body, is fully funded. So that's a little bit of a departure from how these things usually go. They have been doing, I can't even tell you, it's something like more than 7,000 different things are being investigated at this point, and that number goes up almost exponentially day after day. So just the number of things that they are investigating in terms of crimes, and these are all focused on the crime of aggression. So they're receiving reports from people in country, from NGOs, from bystanders, so it's all sorts of recording on your phone, taking witness statements. It's a very complicated and complex thing that personally I think, thank goodness for the ICPA, because I don't know who else would manage and organize that. Separately from this international, the ICC conversation, there's now starting to be a multinational court discussion. And in my mind, this would actually make it very similar to Nuremberg, because there was not a body like the UN that existed at the time. And so the multinational effort is a group of countries that would come together to figure out what the rules are and how to move forward with this, which is exactly what happened at Nuremberg. And the Special Court for Sierra Leone provides a good model for how you prosecute a sitting head of state. That's the only other tribunal that has ever done so. That was Charles Taylor. He was eventually apprehended in Liberia. He thought Liberia was a safe place to travel to. Surprise. And so as he was leaving the government building, he was arrested and then went through the trial system. So between Nuremberg and Sierra Leone, there are some good models for how a multinational group could move this forward. The idea is the multinational effort would be able to move faster than a UN process, because there would be fewer countries that would need to sign off on it. This has really only been over the last couple of months that these conversations have started. So this is a fairly nascent idea, and I don't have a whole lot of details on who the countries are that are involved in these discussions and how this will actually move forward. But the conversation I had with David Crane last week for our program indicated this is a path that he is involved in. And so I hope to learn more and bring more information to you all as that develops. There are some potential other possibilities. So there is another country taking the lead. Germany, as part of, I think, its growth from World War II, has really taken the lead in a lot of prosecutions on a smaller level, whether they be a host country or whether they contribute resources to that. So that is a possibility. The greatest challenge with any individual country doing this is that most heads of other countries have immunity from prosecution by a foreign nation. And so it's not as if Ukraine can just put President Putin on trial because he has immunity from that prosecution. This is, if you think about it in the grand scheme of the global world order, this makes sense. You wouldn't want it to be easy for one country to put the leader of another country on trial. You can see how that could be misused. But that's part of what is complicating some of this today. Again, I appreciate the safeguards there, so I don't want to put that out there as like that is really a challenge. But some topics of conversation from this past weekend in Lviv. The Ukrainians are exceptionally well versed in the law. They do not need our help understanding how can the ICC help them, how can the ICJ help them, how can these judicial mechanisms help them. They have got that covered. Where they need help, I'm not sure that's quite the right way to phrase it. We had a lot of conversations this weekend of like, well, how can the academics help? How can the average person help? And really what it comes down to is how can we convince our government to continue to support Ukraine? So if you are looking for something that you can do, and if you believe that Ukraine should be supported, not going to impute any beliefs on you, then write to your congresspeople, write to your senators, tell them that you think the funding should continue. The state of the war that we're in right now is really a status quo war. Russia thought this would happen very fast and it would be done very early. They were not prepared for a long, drawn-out war. Ukraine, I think, has always had the stomach for the fight, but they don't have the resources for it. And so even with the support from the EU and the United States, it's basically a war of attrition. It's sort of, yes, Ukraine moves a little bit forward, but then Russia pushes back and they move back to the same line. So it will either take a significantly deeper investment in order to actually give Ukraine the force to really repel Russia, or we're going to have to keep this going long enough that both sides realize they have to come to the negotiation table. President Putin, even just, I think yesterday, or it might be this morning with the time difference, has already made a public statement that unless Kyiv is willing to concede certain things, he sees no point, that the war will continue until Kyiv is ready to largely give up the Crimea and the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. It's a little bit, that's being a little bit reductive, but that's basically what it is, that Russia will want to keep the 20% of Ukraine it has already claimed, and possibly ask for more. Because that doesn't fully cover the entirety of where they believe the Russian-speaking citizens are in Ukraine. Timing is of the essence. Time is one of President Putin's greatest assets at this point, because with changes potentially in the leadership of the United States following next year's elections, and we're not the only country going through an election cycle in the next year, so it's us and some European countries as well, with the potential of other wars pulling focus. So Israel and Hamas, the conflict there, that's certainly, I think as soon as that happened, Ukraine disappeared off the front pages, certainly in the United States. And so he is relying on the fact that people are easily distracted and also get bored, to be honest. The longer this goes on, the more people start that thinking of, well, this is just how it is now in this part of the world. And so you lose some of that sensitivity to the atrocities, to the shock value of this. Accountability also becomes more complex if Ukraine loses. Because if the Russian Federation really does come out of this and there is not a negotiated peace, so if this is really Russia winning this war, it will be infinitely harder to hold President Putin accountable, and also infinitely more necessary to do so, because this is not the only world leader watching how this conflict plays out. And there are a lot of authoritarian leaders in the world with expansion ideas. And if they see that this is successful, this may then continue be a sort of a self-perpetuating prophecy as to how this moves forward in other parts of the world. So this is by no means something located only between Russia and Ukraine. And that's, I think, one of the things that has the international community most concerned about how to move forward with this. And this is not the only avenue of accountability. So there are sanctions. And we had a lot of conversations this last week over how those are effective, how they can be thought better, how there could potentially be ways that impact the government but don't impact the citizens, which is usually the conversation about the effectiveness of sanctions. So it's not just holding people accountable from a legal perspective. There are other avenues of accountability as well. And then, as I mentioned before, the most likely end to this at this point is a negotiated peace. And neither side at this point is going to be willing to do that. If we go through another year of this, if we go into another winter where this is still happening, maybe then. But for the Russian Federation and for President Putin, there's a lot of ego involved. There's a lot of face saving. And so I struggle, and again, super glad this is not my job. Like, how would you negotiate that peace? How do you have to try and convince Ukraine to give up some of their territory? For the sake of the world? Does that get back to the conversations about appeasement in World War II. So it's very complex. I have no idea how that will play out. But I would love to open it up to questions. What questions you all, and I, again, purport not to be an expert in this, but happy to field what I can and tell you what else I know. Yes, Dennis.
Kristan, since you were there, was it 4 or 5 days you were in?
Yep.
Could you just give us the sense of at least the people you encountered and whether they are now optimistic or fearful, or those people who are responsible in Ukraine, what is their sense of the next 6 months or year?
Yeah, so the legal community is determined and focused. The everyday citizen is committed, is the best way I can think to describe it. So Lviv, which is fairly far west in Ukraine, is not experiencing anywhere near the daily shocks that the Eastern Front is, like Kyiv. That being said, all of their exterior art installations, like statues, have been wrapped and are protected. The building that we had our conference in usually has a beautiful glass dome. The glass has been removed. So they're absolutely taking precautions that they need to take. And in Lviv, I really got the sense that it was sort of life as usual. It was, kids were sledding in the park and people were going about shopping and working. But in 2022, one of the center's interns was remote from Lviv. And so he spent the entire summer Zooming in for our interactions, and I got the chance to meet him while I was there. And he has joined the Air Force Reserve. He is continuing his studies for his master's in law. He is working at a tech company, and his entire outlook is Ukraine will do what it has to do in order to end this in a way that benefits Ukraine the most. And so, for him, there's no conception of negotiated peace at this point. It is Ukraine will continue to fight until Ukraine is back to the way Ukraine should be. He described to me a close to 200, if not more, year history of people invading Ukraine and being repelled, of Ukraine's borders moving, whether it be into shrinking from Poland or growing in another direction. He said, this is what happens to Ukraine, and we always fight and we always come out of it.
May that be so.
Amen. Yeah.
I'm thinking, this is such a different world from the world of Justice Jackson. And there's because of instantaneous communication. Now, I will say, Kristan, you have just given us the best articulation of that history and the current context that I've heard or read. And I'm immersed in it because it's so horrifying to me in so many ways. But with instant communication, we do know about all the genocides, the other genocides that are going on in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Sudan, Darfur, Azerbaijan, the Armenians, and so many others that I can't even, it's all over the world.
Yes, it is.
So,
There certainly, when Russian Federation invaded Ukraine, part of the international community's attention turned to, can we use this to shine a light on all the other atrocities that are happening? Again, as I mentioned before, for some parts of the world, the Western nations have gotten into the habit of thinking that's just how life is there. That is, Darfur has always been war-torn. The Uyghurs have, I'm not even sure people knew what Uyghurs were a couple of years ago, so and even with Israel and Hamas, there are things I think we think the Middle East is just like indiscriminate bombing, that's just, and obviously that's not true, and that's a reductive way to phrase it, but we have this complacency where that's just how life is in certain places. And that has never been okay. But using this in what you thought were civilized nations or places where this doesn't happen anymore, to realize that yes, this does still happen, has given the opportunity to focus on some of those lesser known things. So for the international humanitarian law community, they are optimistic that this will help broaden people's understanding of war crimes and genocide and how how these acts need to find accountability for whomever is perpetrating them. That's also part of the challenge with the longer this goes on, in that, again, people become complacent. It slips off the news. That you are desensitized to the shock of it. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, but yes. Yeah.
Curious about the humanitarian aspect of it all. Those refugees that left Ukraine at the beginning of the war, are they filtering back into Ukraine now?
They are. There was a lawyer I met this past weekend. Her name is Anastasia, and I'm not remembering the name of the oblast she's from, but it's sort of in the southern-western corner near Romania. And she said in the early months of the war, they received an incredible influx of people from Kyiv. And this is still within Ukraine, but they received an incredible influx of people from Kyiv who were obviously just trying to run as fast as they possibly could. Her region, I think because of the mountains, is a little safer, a little more secure in terms of attack. And she said, now at this point, it's actually almost not quite 50-50 split of those who have decided to go back to Kyiv or go back to their towns on the Eastern Front because this is taking so long, because this wasn't the quick slap that they expected it to be, and go back to their lives with the understanding of, yes, bombs and missiles may be a part of their lives. And there's another percentage, she said, who've decided they really want to stay in her oblast. And so they have moved their factories there. They're building businesses there. And so for even within parts of Ukraine, this has been a little bit of a boom or a boost to certain parts of the country. But there are also, yes, some of the refugees that were in Germany and Poland also are now filtering back into Ukraine for similar rationales. It's, that is their home. That is where they want to be. Yeah. And obviously thinking that they can deal with the stress of what comes. Yes?
You have a couple times referenced Israel and Hamas. Can you at all talk about a sense of, I know it's very early, but this morning on NPR I'm hearing UNICEF talking about how 5,000 children in Gaza have been killed.
Yep. And
can you talk at all about that issue of war crimes vis-a-vis the what
Yep.
we're...
Yeah, I mean, the Israel-Hamas situation is infinitely more complicated, I think, than the ability to report on it. And so, yes, to your point, I think that there will be some sort of reckoning and some sort of accountability that will need to be had for the alleged acts that Israel is perpetrating within Hamas, assuming that they are being described correctly and accurately. There do seem to be some violations of the Rome Statute. Again, Israel not a signatory to it, so we get into that complicated justice mechanism. For some of the reports, and David and I had sort of an aside conversation on this before our program last week, in that some of what seemed like obvious crimes, like Israel bombing a hospital, are not as obvious when you know the facts that Hamas was using the hospital as a shield. And so, so it comes into, this is, I think, going to be one of the most fact-intensive investigations during what's happening in Gaza and the parts of Israel that Gaza has invaded as well. I honestly think this is going to come out with nobody being happy as to what the justice looks like in this. We tend to think of these things as absolutes, and one side loses and one side wins. And I think that is rarely the case, and I think it will be infinitely more complicated for the Israel-Hamas situation. Yes?
When you talk about a hospital, from what I have read, 72 hospitals have been bombed.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, did they, in all those 72 hospitals, they were Hamas?
Right, that's an excellent question. Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like, all of this will be very fact intensive. Each one of these crimes is going to have to be investigated as a standalone crime. And then, so that, again, just just given the sheer volume of what is happening there, you can already see how daunting that task sounds. But there are, similar to Ukraine, there are already NGOs in country that are documenting this. There are obviously private citizens who are documenting it. So this is going to be a very complex way to move forward. I suspect that you are correct, that that will not be the answer for all the destruction that has happened. But at this point, until we know what the facts are, it's hard to make a judgment. Yeah. Yes?
If Justice Jackson were here with us today, what do you think his thoughts would be on the Ukraine situation?
So if Jackson were here today, and let me start by saying we really hate WWRHJD, but I will do my best. And I apologize to anybody who's watching this later on that this what I'm about to say. I think he would certainly understand the path that Ukraine is taking. I will tell you that I think when the United Nations was created, the reason that the 5 permanent members were given their seats was because it was with a sense that they would be the guardians of how the law moves forward. And so the fact that you have one of the permanent seats who has perpetrated this atrocity is not something anybody would have contemplated in 1945. That being said, the other conversation that is happening right now is how do we need to change those conventions and those laws in order to adapt to this new reality? And I think Jackson would be very in favor of that. He was a very pragmatic jurist, and his time in Nuremberg changed him. You know, his jurisprudence prior to his service in Nuremberg and his jurisprudence post-Nuremberg, you see a lot more skepticism about the power of government. And I think he would understand the need for these rules to be updated. There was a lot of conversation this past weekend as well as, are we in another 1945 to 1948 watershed moment? Does a sufficient amount of the world understand the gravity of what is happening? And are they willing to work together in order to change things or create new things if new things need to be created? I like to hope yes, but I don't know, and given our government vote in the last week, I'm not sure we're there yet. But these are all pieces, and these are continuing conversations. Yes?
Is there a sense of why the United States is not a signatory to some of these
Yes.
conventions?
There's absolutely a sense.
What are we guilty of, or what are we afraid of?
Yep. So, and even when the crimes from Nuremberg were being negotiated, the military especially was rather skeptical of the crimes that were being developed there because there was concern that the United States would be held accountable for something. Mm-hmm. My understanding for the Rome Statute is that the United States originally did sign it that was under President Clinton's tenure, when George Bush, but the Congress never ratified it. When George Bush came in as president, he withdrew our signature from it. And so that does, I do absolutely think that probably plays out along party lines, and I think that would play out along party lines today as well. But there has been a general reluctance to submit the United States to anybody else's jurisdiction anywhere in the world. So if you remember, I think it was after I started in this role, so it must have been 2019. Fatou Bensouda, who was then the chief prosecutor of the ICC, had indicated she would be making some inquiries into the United States actions in Afghanistan. And President Trump revoked her passport, so she was not allowed to travel to the United States on her passport. She did still have a diplomatic passport, so she was able to do that, but that was what he could do. And so there has been a general reluctance, and to be honest, this is not surprising, of the United States submitting its citizens to anybody else's jurisdiction. So that's a large reason why.
Thank you.
Yep.
So how about the UN?
Yep. So, the UN, some of the conversations we had this past weekend were also, what about the UN potentially needs to change? So, and obviously one of the first things to come up was, should there be any permanent members of the Security Council? Or is that something that should rotate? There was an expansion at one point to allow the rotation of non-permanent members onto the Security Council, so you get a broader range of ideas. There has also been some conversation as to should only one veto be allowed to scuttle anything, or should there be some greater proportionality in terms of, like, maybe not majority move forward, but like a 2/3 you can move forward with something. This goes back, I think, to that watershed moment and whether people recognize that we're in it. Because in order to modify the UN rules, you will need, I don't know what the percentage is of the UN countries to vote for it. And so it's do people feel sufficiently strongly about this in order to make these modifications? It's general human nature, I think, that giving up power is not something that anybody does lightly, and nations especially. And so you would need to, but that being said, if you have the entirety of the United Nations voting, which is, 194 countries, not sure I got that exactly right, not a UN expert, that there could be enough other countries who are like, yeah, you know what, we've been shut out from the power conversations for long enough that yes, we think this, and there may not be enough of those power countries to offset that. So we'll see, but it is absolutely something that people are talking about.
So the purview of the UN should be the safety and well-being of the entire world.
And that is its purview. It is, I think, complicated by the fact that the UN doesn't really have an enforcement body. So it is people have subjected themselves to UN jurisdiction or to these conversations. And for now, it is the best forum that we have for global considerations and discussions at that level. But we'll see. I mean, some of their agencies are supremely successful, like the IAEA and the UNCHR and things like that. So there are a variety of, certainly their agencies that are doing amazing work, but the UN plenary itself likely needs some work.
So the idea of justice.
Yes.
That Justice Jackson was, I think in the segment that you started with, your favorite speech of his ever.
Yep.
And he's talking about justice in a way preventing revenge.
100%. So Jackson, there was a crime that Jackson was hoping to get into this that he was not successful in, and that was really a crime that would make war itself illegal. That war should not be the way that we solve our problems, and the crime of aggression was sort of as close as we could come to that goal, which, as I mentioned, was not one of the crimes in Nuremberg. So this is one of the things I love. So I mentioned that Jackson, his whole philosophy for Nuremberg was about justice and not vengeance. Also, during the course of the tribunal itself, not once did he recommend a sentence or an outcome for anyone. In his mind, that was the judge's role. And so all he could do was present the evidence in the best way that he could present it. And then there was an arbiter who would actually decide, yes, you met your burden of proof. No, you didn't meet your burden of proof. And if you did, here's what the punishment is that we see results from this outcome. I love, as I mentioned in his opening statement, that it's, they stayed the hand of vengeance. That is such an evocative phrase for me. And my hope is that's always how the law works. Now, I'm not Pollyanna enough to think that that's true, but that is, I think, the best aspiration for law that anyone could ever articulate.
Restorative justice.
Mm-hmm. Well, and restorative justice, I would think, is even a little bit different. Restorative justice implies, or in actuality works towards getting something from this point back to a point that somebody thinks it should be. Right. Right. Yes. My hope is that the law, and this was a conversation we were having, and to be honest, nobody had a really good answer for this one, was how do you stop these things from happening? Like, why can't we stop ourselves from getting to the point of needing to heal, of needing to hold people accountable? Is there something the law can be doing more effectively on the front end to stop us from even getting to that point? All right, thank you all very much. I appreciate it.